Mom. There's one in every high school, an activity that everyone does for months on end, a fad everyone talks about, and if you aren't doing it, you don't get to participate in the conversation. I'm not talking about drugs or sex, I'm talking about scaring each other. For months in my high school, all anyone could talk about was the haunted houses they visited over the weekends. Jeff floated up the stairs. You could hear the woman crying out for her children. I called bullshit on all of their stories. Even the ones people clearly thought they experienced, figuring it was faulty wiring or old houses settling. I wasn't too interested in their stupidity, but little did I know I was about to experience things for myself, unwillingly. I'm from a very small town in the upper Midwest. My childhood home was literally in the middle of nowhere. Our closest neighbor was about a mile away. The home I grew up in until I was 14 was a rental. Then my parents bought some land and moved a huge old Victorian farmhouse onto it. The house hadn't been occupied in several years, probably decades. The last person who owned it wanted it off his property so the cows could roam free on the land. I still don't know when the house was built, but the original basement had a sign that it was 1909 was the year they installed the furnace, so sometime before that. After the house was moved, there were some repairs that needed to be done before we could move in. It was months before we were able to put anything into it. The first night we actually got to stay there was when I realized my family was not the only ones living in it. My parents picked me up from a school function late on a Saturday. The new house was kind of on the way to the old house, so when my dad turned on the road to go to the new house, I asked, "Where are we going?" To which my dad just smiled. I kindly reminded him that I had the clothes on my back and nothing else to say at the new house. We took a detour back to the old house, grabbing the essentials: toothbrush, pajamas, books, posters. We headed back to the new house. I spent the remainder of my evening putting up the posters I had saved from numerous magazines of cute boys and even cuter animals. I hadn't put them up in the old house, not wanting to rip them down to put in the new house. I listened to music and set up my room for a while before going to bed. Before I go any further, I need to give you a layout of sorts of this house. There are 4 levels: basement, main floor, upstairs, attic. The basement is basically a large living area with the laundry area, no bedrooms down there. The main level is kitchen, dining room, living room, fancy living room, small bathroom. Upper level is 4 bedrooms with a second full bathroom. Attic is a big open space. My parents gave me the option to have my bedroom in the attic or have the master bedroom on the 2nd floor since I would be moving out in a few years. I chose the actual bedroom because I want the closet. The attic never creeped me out. I seriously considered taking it as my room, but I'm a closet girl. What could I say? When you walk up the stairs to the left is my sister's room, and my room because they are both the biggest. On the right is a smaller spare bedroom, my brother's room, and the bathroom between the 2 rooms. The hallway is very wide, and at the end of the hallway is a door to the upper level of the porch. When we first moved in, there was no porch yet, so the door led to a long drop onto a rocky driveway. The master bedroom is huge, almost a perfect square. Since I had not been able to set up my room that day, my sister and her friend set it up for me. They put my dresser by the door, the desk by the window, and the bed on the opposite side of the room from the door. They did a pretty good job. I just had to personalize it, so I turned on some music and shut my door so anyone trying to sleep wouldn't hear. My brother's room is right across the wide hall from mine. His bed was right next to his bedroom door, and his door was cracked open just a bit. By the time I went to bed, everyone else in the house was sleeping. I was just falling asleep in my new bed at the new house when I woken by a whisper. "Mom, Mom." Like when you're little and you wake up in the middle of the night to find you wet the bed or thrown up all over yourself, so you go get your mom and whisper right next to her ear. That's what I heard. I opened my eyes to see nothing. I had cracked open my bedroom door just a tiny bit to allow the hall light to seep in, just in case I woke up and needed to use the bathroom without having to turn on the lights. My closet door was also open about 3 inches. There was no one there who could have whispered. Confused, I fell back asleep thinking it was probably my brother who woke up and being 7 in the new house for the first time was disoriented about what was going on. I didn't say anything to anyone at first, but after I thought more about it, there was no possible way I could have heard my brother whisper from that far away. I couldn't stop thinking about the strange whisper and who it could have been. Also, I'd like to remind you, I now occupy the master bedroom where my parents of the previous family most likely slept. Finally, I told my mom. To my surprise, she didn't dismiss me or tell me I was hearing things or that the house was probably settling. She paused just a second, most likely trying to decide if I was mature enough to handle what she was about to tell me, and said, "I've heard it too." The Silhouette. If you've watched Mom, great. If you haven't, I highly recommend watching it before this to have a better understanding of the situation. All of the events I'm about to describe all happened, for real, to me and my family. It's okay if you don't believe it. I honestly wouldn't either if I was hearing it. I never believed any of the stories from my friends that had experiences. They all seemed like bullshit. I'm still skeptical when I hear some stories. They seem a little too far-fetched or exaggerated for entertainment. Not mine. These are 100% true accounts of what happened. Now, I don't know how the ghost world works. Maybe they're in another dimension. Maybe they could think they're still living. Maybe they could see or sense us all the time, or maybe just at certain times. Our ghost wasn't always around, but he sure made his presence known as soon as there was activity in the house. It hadn't been occupied in decades, so maybe this little kid ghost had been alone for so long, and now all of a sudden there are people around again and he's trying so hard to get our attention. It makes me a little sad to think about it. At 14, you're pretty susceptible to everything around you. Friends, family, movies, and TV. As my mom was studying the look on my face, trying to decide if I should know the whole story, I'm sure these thoughts went through her mind. Does she want to scare the shit out of me, or should she just leave it alone and let me figure things out for myself? She chose option A. I also think she was relieved someone else had experienced something, so she wasn't alone and thought she was just hearing strange voices. She had been under a lot of stress to get the house ready for her family to live in, staying up well into the night at the house, got up to get us ready for school, still had a job, and took at least 2 hours out of every day to do some sort of cardio. She was superwoman. No wonder she may have thought she was just hearing things. Lack of sleep alone will do that to a person. In the winter, my mom rode her stationary bike in the living room after we all went to school. It was loud and obnoxious, so she had to turn on the TV up to a ridiculous volume to be able to hear it over the bike. This was why she preferred to be at home alone when she rode it, so she didn't disrupt everyone else in the house. This was when my mom heard the whisper, "Mom, Mom." She heard it over the loud bike and the loud TV. She paused everything to listen. Completely alone in the house and knowing she was, it was quite a shock. She didn't hear it again, so she kept writing. This is what she told me after I told her I had heard it. Then she said there was more. Over the winter was when she would go to work on the house. Winter in the Midwest means it's dark by 5 p.m. We're used to it, no biggie. So one night, my mom, exhausted, goes to leave the new house to go home to bed. She's driving away from the house down the driveway when she notices she left the upstairs hall light on. She stops the car to go back in and turn it off when she notices something strange. There's someone in the window up there. It appears to be the silhouette of a small child's head and fingers peeking out through the window in the door, as if the child isn't quite tall enough, so they're standing on their tiptoes, gripping the frame to see what's outside. My mom didn't go back in to turn off the light. That was the first sighting. The second was a couple months before we moved into the new house. My parents met with some friends at a bar. They happened to run into the electrician who worked on the house before we moved into it. He had quite the story for them. If my parents were working on the house, it was open and unlocked. You could get from the basement to the attic, no problem. When my parents weren't there, but crews were working on it, they only had access to the basement. The electrician was making a few changes and checks one evening, making sure all was working properly. He had been in and out of the basement, looking at lights and whatnot. He was outside making sure the yard light was going to come on once it got dark enough, and happened to look up at the house and see the silhouette of a child in an upstairs bedroom. He was there alone with no crew members or their children, and didn't even have access to the main level, let alone the second floor. He was clearly shaken up by it and was relieved when my mom said she had also seen a similar silhouette in the window of the door at the end of the hall. He said it wasn't in the hall window, it was in the bedroom to the right. My bedroom. Elliot. So it's been a while since I've been able to continue my story. Sorry. If you're seeing this part for the first time, you should probably go back and watch Mom and The Silhouette, because this might not make any sense if you don't. If you had watched them both, you are aware of the child haunting the home I grew up in. He's been spotted and heard. Now I'd like to tell you about a little research my mom did after I told her about the creepy whisper I heard the first night we stayed here. I mentioned my parents moved the house onto some land they purchased. The previous owner was an elderly man who ended up in hospice care, unable to carry on a conversation for too long. When my mom went to visit him, she realized she was not going to get very far by talking to him. He couldn't even remember who she was. No biggie, there are records and death certificates, right? Well, sort of. She ended up finding a small cemetery near the location the house was originally standing. It was a small family one, overgrown and hard to find, but there was a grave that was marked Elliot. The marker said the child died at 6. That seemed about right. A 6-year-old would behave the way our ghost was behaving. But why had Elliot died? In the early 1900s, kids died in their sleep because of numerous things that doctors back then didn't even know about. Simple diseases we're now vaccinated for were terminal back then. Sad, I know. Not completely satisfied with her findings, my mom headed to the library to see what else she could find. Records weren't kept as well as they are today back then, but she did find something. There was a small obituary on a child named Elliot who was said to be about 4 years old. Okay, now what are the chances of a child around the same age, with the same name, dying around the same time on the same property? I think someone messed up on the age or year Elliot died. Either way, Elliot didn't go where they were supposed to go. Not knowing if Elliot is a boy or girl, I have a feeling he's a boy, so from here on, I will call him a he. My mother had to be content with her search for the time being. There are now no living relatives to ask, so we have to rely on records even though there may not be totally accurate. It's a bummer. I'm curious about this child. Why is he still here? What does he need? How can we help him? I have no idea. Not that I didn't try. After that first night of hearing him whisper, I kept the closet door closed, not wanting him to wake me up again. I spent a few evenings in my closet on a beanbag chair trying to talk to him and getting no response. I had some luck with the Ouija board at a friend's birthday party once. I suppose you like to hear that story, and since it's somewhat relevant, here, I'll tell you. My best friend from childhood had lost her grandmother to a heart attack very suddenly when we were in 4th grade. As a 4th grader, those things aren't understood fully like they are when you're older. It really hit her a few years later when she finally realized what had happened, and she got super bummed she hadn't been able to say goodbye. That's when one of us suggested a spirit board. What's the worst that could happen? In our case, her grandma can visit us, and that's exactly what happened. Throughout the night, I had been constantly pulling my hair behind my ear when my grown-out bangs got in my face. Typical 13-year-old, but I wasn't able to push them out of my face since my fingers were glued to the planchette where we were summoning the spirit. I was looking down at the board waiting for words to be spelled out when my hair was gently scooped out of my face and placed behind my ear, much like a grandmother would do for her granddaughter. After what seemed like several minutes, I looked at my friend who was crying. We all immediately took our fingers off the board to console her. Admittedly, a little freaked out, my friend said she was able to say goodbye to her grandma because she had appeared in the corner and smiled at her. She was the only one who saw her, but I told her she had put my hair back behind my ear for me. She had been a wonderful lady, and it wouldn't have been out of the ordinary for her to do that for me. That was before my encounter with Elliot. If my only other spiritual experience had been a less pleasant one, I may have been more apprehensive about the whisper. And since it had been a successful one, I decided to have some friends over and try it myself. We got nothing. Not even a glimmer. Maybe it's because he wasn't related to any of us, or he was just hiding or shy. We will never know. I didn't hear him again while I lived there. That doesn't mean he didn't announce his presence. But that's another story for another day. Keep creepin', peeps. How losing my mother saved my life. My mother died a little over 2 years ago on October 31st of 2016. It was sudden and sort of unexpected. But then when does one look at death as expected? I digress. Apologies, reader, I tend to ramble. Kudos to you if you get to the end, and it's a bit of a long, painful story, but I feel it's important as well as therapeutic to tell. I moved away from my family, my mom especially, since she and I were the closest, about 3 years ago. My mom was of course sad to see me go, but knew it was best for my family. So I moved, and unbeknownst to me, my mother neglected her own health to care for my asshole male DNA donor and my autistic but amazingly intelligent younger brother. So she got sick. Really sick. Like rushed to the hospital and into the ICU kind of sick. I'm my mother's POA, so I was notified, and she called me to tell me not to panic. So I panicked. big time. She tells me she had a hard time breathing one day, so my brother tried to convince her to go to the ER. And it got so bad that she got scared and called 911. Saved her life, for a little while. Turns out my mother had a severe case of pneumonia. She smoked, I had suspected for years she had COPD, and she knew but wouldn't tell me. So okay, pneumonia. I work in the medical field, I know it's serious but treatable, and she's obviously doing okay if she's calling me, right? Except at the end, she drops the bombshell. They found cancer on her chest CT. My mother had cancer. That was the first time in the next few weeks my world would shift on its axis. This was October 10th. So I cry and I freak out, but when the nurse takes over and I start asking about stages, type, treatment plans, scans, etc., she was very vague, but told me it was bad. She had met with an oncologist and was going to do chemo. So I relaxed a little, figured it was gonna suck, but we would get through this. The next weeks went by in a blur. I spoke to my mother daily, usually on my ride to work to see how chemo went, how she was feeling, etc. I had made a trip home 2 days after I found out, thanks to some amazing friends and family that helped me and my husband get there. So I laid eyes on her, judged for myself how bad I thought it was. I called her after her chemo appointment, Thursday, October 27th. She was feeling okay, but very tired, so we didn't talk long. I could recall exactly where I was on my drive and what song on Pandora I paused to talk to her. Her last words to me were "bless you for ringing." My mother was British and very verbally proper, so that was her typical goodbye. I hung up from that call not knowing that that would be the last time I heard her voice. Everything was going okay from then up until October 29th. My world shifted again. I got a frantic email from my brother. He doesn't like phones, stating our mother was in the hospital and something about papers that if her heart stopped again, that they couldn't restart it and I needed to call the hospital. So I have a feeling of absolute dread sinking in. It's 10 o'clock at night. What is going on? I call the hospital and find out she is in the ER. Okay, she got sick. Let's talk to charge to find out why. I actually got to talk to the ER doctor that told me my mother was intubated and unconscious in the ER. Cue panic attack. My mother had gotten sick at home, vomited, and we think she aspirated or inhaled her vomit. Bad times. My poor brother called 911 and they came to their house and resuscitated her. But she had suffered brain damage or something because she wouldn't wake up. Then the really bad shocking news. My mother signed a DNR, or do not resuscitate, which means she had legal papers saying that they had to remove the tube and let her go. My mother didn't tell anyone. It wasn't until they got her to the hospital and pulled her records they knew. I am over 800 miles away, and this doctor is saying he has to let my mother die. I am sobbing at this point, begging him to keep it long enough for me to get home to see her. He refused, saying it was her wish to go. I had no choice but to agree. So I went to bed thinking my mother died that night. I called the hospital the next day expecting the news, but my mother was still alive. My hopes soared. My mom is a fighter. The nurse tells me she still isn't conscious. I told her to tell my mom, hang on, I'm coming. I made the 12-hour plus drive home to get to the hospital to see my mother. I got there at 1 a.m. on October 31st, Halloween, my favorite holiday. The third time my world shifted on its axis was sitting in the hospital parking lot preparing to go see my mother. Walking into the hospital was surreal, like I was watching some other daughter walk down the hall to her mother's ICU room. One thing about ICU is how quiet they can be. I stopped at the nurse's desk, told them who I was and who I was there to see. The nurse gave me a sympathetic look and took me to her room. The second I stepped foot in her doorway, I knew my mother was gone. A husk of her lay in that hospital bed, truly one of the most horrific things I have ever seen. Her body struggled to live, these horrible gasping respirations. She was gone, but her body was still here. Meds kept her blood pressure up enough to sustain life. I wanted to rip it all off of her. This wasn't right. I knew my brother needed to be there to say goodbye, so I sat by my mother's bedside alone for 9 hours watching her gasp for air. Her body had shut down, except her heart, lungs, and a tiny portion of brain. It was the worst thing I ever had to do, but I talked to her, told her about my babies and how excited they were to trick or treat. My brother, an asshole, got to the hospital around 9:30. My mom's oncologist met me before they got there and dropped the bombshell the cancer my mom had was ovarian, with mets everywhere, and she recommended I get tested for the gene that increases risks. I just kind of nodded in shock. I signed the papers to take my mom off all medical support shortly after she left. Once my brother, an asshole, got there, the nurse took all the machines and lines off, and I held her hands as they gave her meds to make her comfortable. My mother died October 31st at 10:07 in the morning. My whole world fell off its axis. I was now the caretaker of my family, and I had to figure out how to be her. I got things as situated as I could in the 3 days I could stay, arranged her cremation as she wanted, and ended up paying for it because the asshole left her life insurance lapse. I grieved the loss of my mother heavily and had to scramble to take care of my brother, an asshole. To say I was stressed and busy was an understatement. I put the oncologist warning out in my head until almost 2 years later when I had pain in my abdomen. Then suddenly her warning popped in my head. I had blood work done and found out I do carry that gene that increases my cancer risk, right as my own doctor finds a mass on my ovary. Cue world shift again. My doctor immediately orders more scans and schedules me for surgery rather than do a biopsy and wait. I'm on board with this idea, so I went in for surgery December of last year. My doctor found a suspicious mass on my left ovary. He removed both ovaries, both tubes, and mass. The biopsy on the mass actually came back benign, but on my other ovary, the one with no visible mass, they found stage 1 cancer. I had ovarian cancer and had no idea. By doing the surgery, the surgeon actually caught it early. If my mother had not died of ovarian cancer and her doctor told me to get genetically tested, I would not have known I had it until it was too late. Ovarian cancer spreads quickly, and usually by the time it's found, like my mother, it's too late. My blood test result pushed my doctor to do more than biopsy, and removing both ovaries, he caught the real threat. My mother's death saved my life, along with the BRCA gene test. I cannot stress enough that everyone should get that test to find out your cancer risks. Knowledge is power, especially in healthcare. I have sent my mother's oncologist flowers every year on her birthday and Halloween.